Welcome to part 5, the final part of Tao, the way of nature, a full return to nature. One that we are all ever working toward. If, that is, we care about ourselves and the world around us. And that may mean sacrifice to the extent of our own belief systems, to fight our own cognitive dissonance, which is those mental blockades of getting past our old belief systems and being able to emerge as a more optimum, more sustainable individual. An individual who is more self-reliant, who has more freedom because they're not tied or attached to ideology, tied or attached to different nations and borders and flags and titles and power and greed and all of it that comes from our current yang materialist society. And so, as you see this, as we move on, may you always remember to think for yourself. But I will say that the tie between philosophical anarchism and Taoism is no new concept. And if you were here for the last part, it would not alarm you because there are many quotes from Lao Tzu and Zhuang Zhou that support this stance. And the word anarchism, again, just means no rulers, not no rules, but it does imply that individuals should live voluntarily or without aggression being legitimized by authority or statism. And so, as you can see on this slide, there are many different people who have acknowledged this, not just myself. In fact, we're going to actually go over many historical figures as well toward the end of this presentation. And you can see that I have highlights, I have some titles of some works that make this connection. An Anarcho-Taoist Manifesto, the Tao of Anarchy, and surprisingly also the Metaphysics of Anarchism, where it even says political Taoism is the only true form of anarchism. Speculative Taoism is the one pure form of metaphysics. So that is quite interesting. That article goes over quite a lot as well, and some of these are very well written, and there's a lot more out there actually. But I figured to screenshot some of those that seem to really use Lao Tzu and Zhuang Zhou's quotes just as I do. And you can see that if you just go to the mere Wikipedia and look at precursors to anarchism, the first thing that pops up is ancient China, where it says Taoism, the first word in the very first paragraph. And it says that many of the Taoists actually lived in an anarchic lifestyle. So there's a lot of ties that could be made here. You can even see there's a flag. We'll go over that. There's common colors being used here for Taoist anarchism, which again isn't really a thing. It's a title, it's an identity. We don't want to attach ourselves to it. But there's even pages, there's articles. This is not a new connection or concept. Just as there's that quote, there is nothing new under the sun. And especially since Taoism goes back thousands of years, this is quite impressive to see this connection, being that anarchism is relatively new. It's something that arose out of the 1800s into the 1900s. So that's not even 200 years ago from when I record this now. Even Taoist writers from back then in the years BC actually support this conclusion I'll be sharing with you guys. But if we look at symbolism, like that flag right there that you see on the left side of the slide, where you have the white and the black, well, typically in anarchism, the black stands for non-aggression, non-violence, or just anarchism, and then usually it's paired with another color. So yellow would usually be self-ownership, voluntarism, or capitalism, or free trade, or free markets. Red might be setting up communes and setting up collective societies that people choose to live together. There's pink, there's dark green for people who really like nature and feel like technology might be a threat to human existence. There's many different types that people make sort of to tie into anarchism to make their position a bit more clear, although again it can stray a bit more toward the identity issue. But typically when you see white paired with black, like we do see with the yin-yang symbol, well, white actually stands for non-resistance, pacifism, unity, simplicity, or spirituality. So you'll see it among like Christian anarchism, which is also among the roots of all anarchism. And you'll see it among pacifist anarchism, which actually there's a lot of people who hold that position, again, using Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and what they did in history and how powerful it was to create change. So just realize that there's value in all these different ways of thinking, and they aren't just baseless, they aren't just for chaos, they have a philosophical undertone. And so even Leo Tolstoy recognized the Tao, and this is a very important thing to understand because Leo Tolstoy, who's Russian, is known as one of the greatest writers of all time according to many different sources, and he was outspokenly an anarchist, and he tells us what to do in 1899 from Letters to a Chinese Gentleman. He says, quote, "Only adhere to that liberty which consists in following the rational way of life. Zey Tao is a Tao, and of themselves will be abolished all the calamities which your officials cause you, and your oppression and plunder by Europeans will become impossible." So he's saying follow the Tao and all your problems will go away, essentially. You will free yourselves from your officials by not fulfilling their demands, and above all, by not obeying, you will cease to contribute to the oppression and plunder of each other. You will free yourselves from plunder on the part of Europeans by keeping the Tao and not recognizing yourselves as belonging to any state or as being responsible for the deeds committed by your government. If the people recognize human power as higher than the power of God, higher than the law or Tao, then the people will always be slaves, and the more so, the more complex their organization of power, such as a constitutional one, which they institute and to which they submit. Only those people can be free for whom the law of God or Tao is the sole supreme law to which all others should be subordinated. If the Chinese people were only to continue to live as they have formerly lived, a peaceful, industrious, agricultural life, following in their conduct the principles of their three religions, Confucianism, Daoism, Buddhism, all three in their basis coinciding, Confucianism in the liberation from all human authority, Taoism in not doing to others what one does not wish done to oneself, and Buddhism in love towards all men and all living beings, then of themselves would disappear all those calamities from which they now suffer, and no powers could overcome them. So a very powerful quote from Leo Tolstoy, sharing with us the value of the Tao. So again, we're seeing now some of the positive perspectives coming back in. I know that we had a period of this presentation where we looked at some of the dark sides of humanity and what we do to each other. But again, we have to not ignore the problem at hand and realize that that problem is part of the process of learning. If we seek the bigger picture, we seek this yin-yang Taoist perspective that tells us, let's look at the law of God. Let's not get stuck on human powers and the governments that tell us what to do. No, there's this Tao that is teaching us what to do every single day of our lives. And this is the real thing that we have to follow, Leo Tolstoy is basically telling us here. And so, if we look across some historical figures, we may come across Bao Jinying, who lived between late 200 AD and 400 AD. He was a philosopher and Taoist known as China's first political anarchist. He's the author of the text Neither Lord Nor Subject, which was preserved by Taoist Gi Hong, which is a practitioner and philosopher. You can see a book cover for this short little text that we're going to actually be reading here in the following slide. And so you can see the anarchy symbol being basically merged here with the yin-yang symbol. And so let's just read over this, because I find this absolutely astonishing that this was written so long ago and is so relevant to now. And based on my estimation of understanding voluntarism and anarchism and how these ideas are growing alongside Taoism in the modern day, I think these ideas can make a great revival and truly change the world for the better in the near future. And so this is Bao Yingying, a Taoist, telling us from his text, neither lord nor subject. Quote, "In the earliest times, there was neither lord nor subject. Wells were dug for drinking water, the fields were plowed for food. Work began at sunrise and ceased at sunset. Everyone was free and at ease, neither competing with each other nor scheming against each other, and no one was either glorified or humiliated. The way and its virtue, the Daoism, having fallen into decay, a hierarchy was established. Customary regulations for promotion and degradation and for profit and loss proliferated. Ceremonial garments such as the gentry's sash and sacrificial cap and the imperial blue and yellow robes for worshipping heaven and earth were elaborated. Buildings of earth and wood were raised high into the sky, with the beams and rafters painted red and green. The heights were overturned in quest of gems. The depths dived into in search of pearls. But however vast a collection of precious stones people might have assembled, it still would not have sufficed to satisfy their whims, and a whole mountain of gold would not have been enough to meet their expenditure. So sunk were they in depravity and vice, having transgressed against the fundamental principles of the great beginning. Daily they became further removed from the ways of their ancestors, and turned their back more and more upon man's original simplicity. Because they promoted the worthy to office, ordinary people strove for reputation, and because they prized material wealth, thieves and robbers appeared. The sight of desirable objects tempted true and honest hearts, and the display of arbitrary power and love of gain opened the road to robbery. So they made weapons with points and with sharp edges, and after that there was no end to usurpations and acts of aggression, and they were only afraid lest crossbows should not be strong enough, shields stout enough, lances sharp enough, and defenses solid enough. Yet all this could have been dispensed with if there had been no oppression and violence from the start. Although tyrants such as Jie and Shou were able to burn men to death, massacre their advisors, make mincemeat of the feudal lords, cut the barons into strips, tear out men's hearts and break their bones, and go to the furthest extremes of tyrannical crime, down to the use of torture by roasting and grilling, however cruel they may by nature have been, how could they have done such things if they had to remain among the ranks of the common people? If they gave way to their cruelty and lust and butchered the whole empire, it was because, as rulers, they could do as they pleased. As soon as the relationship between lord and subject is established, hearts become daily more filled with evil designs, until the manacled criminals sullenly doing forced labor in the mud and the dust are full of mutinous thoughts. The sovereign trembles with anxious fear in his ancestral temple, and the people simmer with revolt in the midst of their poverty and distress. And to try to stop them revolting by means of rules and regulations, or control them by means of penalties and punishments, is like trying to dam a river in full flood with a handful of earth, or keeping the torrents of water back with one finger. So, that is an excerpt of this text, and I find it very astonishing. A lot of parallels to what we talked about before, with understanding that the root cause to anarchism or statism, understanding statism, is the relationship between the ruled and the ruler. That this relationship would not exist if it wasn't for statism, the belief that individuals have a moral right or legitimate right to rule over other individuals' lives. That belief is responsible for most of the bloodshed throughout history, and as demonstrated here in this fantastic quote. Now, there was another individual. His name was Zhuangzi. He was a Chinese Taoist, lived between late 200 AD and 300 AD. He lived a life of play, much like Zhuangzi. And so he wrote this text, the biography of Master Great Man. So this is from Zhuangzi, a Taoist. Quote, "The weak were not cowed by oppression, nor did the strong prevail by their force. For then there was no ruler, and all beings were peaceful, no officials, and all affairs were well ordered. Men preserved their persons and cultivated their natures, not deviating from their norm. Only because it was so were they able to live to great ages. But now when you make music, you get sounds in disorder. When you indulge in sexual activity, you weaken the body. You change your exterior appearance to hide your passions within you. Filled with desires, you seek excess. You practice counterfeits to make yourself famous. When rulers are set up, tyranny arises. When officials are established, thieves are born. You idly ordain rights and laws to bind the lowly common people. You cheat the stupid and fool the unskillful, and hide your knowledge to make yourselves appear to be like spirits. The strong look fierce and are oppressive. The weak shiver with anguish and are servile. You pretend to be honest to attain your avaricious ends. You harbor dangerous thoughts within you, but appear benevolent to the outside world. When you commit some crime, you do not repent of it, but when you encounter some good fortune, you take it as a matter for personal pride. Now, if there were no honors, those in low position would bear no grudges. If there were no riches, the poor would not struggle to obtain them. Each would be satisfied within himself and would have nothing else to seek. If liberalities and favors did not bind one to a sovereign, there would be no reason to expose oneself to death and defeat against his enemies. If rare music were not performed, the ear's hearing would not be altered. If lascivious views were not shown, the eye's sight would not be changed. If the ear and the eye were not altered and changed, there would be no way to disrupt the spirit. But now you honor merit to make one another exalted. You compete with your abilities to set one above the other. You struggle for power to make one rule over another. And you esteem honors so that you can offer them to one another. You encourage the whole world to pursue these aims, and the result is that the upper and lower classes harm one another. You exhaust all the creatures of the universe to their very limits in order to purvey to the endless desires of your senses. This is no way to nourish the common people. And then you fear the people will understand what is going on, so you add rewards to please them and strengthen punishments to keep them in awe. But when there is no more wealth, rewards can no longer be given. When there are no more punishments, sentences cannot be carried out. Then begin the calamities of ruined states, assassinated rulers, and armies defeated and dispersed. Are these things not caused by you, gentlemen? Your rights and laws are indeed nothing more than the methods of harmful robbers, of troublemakers, of death and destruction. And you think they form an unalterable way of excellent conduct. How erroneous you are. Wow. What a quote from this text, the biography of Master Great Man. And I mean, is this not telling? I've read a lot of different anarchist philosophy texts throughout history. This reminds me a lot of Lysander Spooner and what he talks about. And again, nobody really learns about him, ever. He goes against a lot of worldviews, even the chaotic anarchist, because they're philosophically based. They're based in understanding natural laws. I mean, Spooner wrote a whole thing about natural laws of the universe and morality and following that. And, you can clearly see these people aren't against order in the world. They're not against people coming together. They're against rulers telling others how to live their own lives. They're against this greed, insatiable desires that man falls into. And they see it ultimately then as like this fall of society. It's absolutely alarming. To anyone who's a Taoist out there, I plead you to really look at your own writings in this case. Look at these historical writings and see what you can make of it for yourself. I think this is extremely powerful for the modern day in getting past our political divisions. Just for one division in the world, at least, a very big one, in fact. It's perhaps the biggest one that is aggregated that I've noticed, is the idea of government authority, because the reason why is because people assume government to be nature itself, the law of the universe that they must follow. And individuals can't serve two masters. They have to serve truth and morality, I would hope, or the Tao. They can't serve humankind unless humankind also aligns to the Tao, right? And so this is this binding, universal, helpful tool for humanity, the Tao. And yet we ignore it in the attempt to play God and play as nature and play as the Tao and choose to alter life and tell other people what to do. It's absurd. Well, here's another historical figure. His name is Lao Tzu. He went through many different ideas through his lifetime. Some people have to experiment to understand where they place themselves. He is actually known as the father of Chinese anarchism, and he came to realize that violence is not the solution to solving the problems, as well as the fact that the whole system needs to be changed, and that requires the masses. He also came to understand that morality would be a requirement. So anytime people talk about politics nowadays, I guarantee you most of the time they're not talking about morality, they're not talking about the Tao, and they're not talking about the average everyday person. They want to put some person in power, one select individual, and put them up on a pedestal, and then they ask for money, and then they build an identity, and they build titles. They do the exact opposite of what the Tao teaches us. And so he, Lao Tzu, even created a conscience society with a 12-point pledge. So this is a voluntary, little group that he set up. And it said, do not eat meat, do not drink liquor, do not smoke tobacco, do not use servants, do not ride in sedan chairs or rickshaws, do not marry, do not use a family name, do not serve as an official, do not serve as a body, do not serve as a member of a representative body, do not join a political party, do not serve in the army or navy, and do not believe in a religion. And so, quite interesting. We think of conscience, we think again of our ability to do right as opposed to wrong, to listen to our intuition, our common sense knowledge. And so I'm guessing his 12-point pledge here comes from the basis of these things make a society less pure. They tend to corrupt human beings, and we can see that with each one of these, even marriage, because typically it might be under a strict setting of it has to be done a certain way, and that can go against the Tao in the sense of it is strict, it has a set ritual. So kind of like Confucianism, it deals with a lot of rituals, whereas Taoism, it's more about aligning to nature. Let's let the love come naturally. Let's not set up a bunch of identities around it. We can see how this can be an issue in the modern day, where people are fighting, men versus women, and who has more rights or not, and then people act like they're victims, and then people want to empower others, and then it can be counterintuitive, and then they focus so much on it, and it makes other people upset. And marriage, there's a lot of superficial ideas around it where people are like, well, you got to get money, you got to have a cake, you have to have a certain person read you certain lines. They may not even live with each other before they get married, but then society gets in their way and they lose what they first had because of the materialism. And there's so many factors at play that we can't really generalize, but generally speaking, we can see that certain things, like telling people what to do, is counterintuitive. And so even then telling people what not to do can be counterintuitive, but usually the do nots are more powerful, like in the sense of Wu Wei, because it's saying to return back to simplicity, like Lao Tzu says, to unlearn every day until you arrive at non-action, or Wu Wei. Then we also have Liu Shibai, and he is known as the most important Chinese theorist in anarchism. And he was a philologist. I don't know what exactly that is, but he's greatly influenced by Daoism. He was a teacher, and he died at a young age with a lot of potential. When I was doing research on him, I'm like, wow, this guy did a lot of stuff, and he wasn't that old. He had a whole future ahead of himself, so a little unfortunate there, but he still nonetheless created some impact in his time, and he created systems to better calculate chronology, so that's time. He started a newspaper called Tianyi Bao, which is called Natural Justice, and it's known as the first anarchist journal in the Chinese language, but it got shut down by the government of Japan. Probably not a surprise there. He worked alongside his wife He Jin, who advocated for the freedom of women. And he also worked alongside Jing Meiju. Many ideas were shared among Russian thought and writers like Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy had a great influence on the people at the time. And the language Esperanto was also supported by anarchist efforts at times, and it shared many similar ideals. He also was influenced by French anarchist Jacques Lycée Reclus. So that's another individual you may learn about. Another is actually Ba Xin. And Ba Xin was a Chinese anarchist, translator, and writer, but he aged to 100 years old. So that's from 1904 to 2005. I'd be curious if there's any footage of him online talking about anything, but he is responsible for the work titled Family. He states, quote, "Only by not forgetting the past can we be the master of the future, and that my pen is a light and my body a flame. Until both burn down to ash, my love and my hate will remain here in the world. And I can assure you, Ba Xin, if you're listening to me in the spirit world, your voice is definitely going to be carried on, as with many anarchists throughout history who were seen as rebels, just for thinking for themselves. You are not the only one." So don't worry about that, my friend. I mean, here is another good example. Ursula K. Le Guin. She is a famous American author, and she was inspired by nonviolent resistance activism, Daoism, Carl Jung, and anarchism. So just bringing together all the many different ideas that we talked about in this presentation, I find it fascinating. And if we learn about one of her books, The Dispossessed, it was set on twin planets of Urus and Eneres, and it features a planned anarchist society depicted as an ambiguous utopia. Unlike classical utopias, the society of Eneres is portrayed as neither perfect nor static. The protagonist, Shevek, finds himself traveling to Urus to pursue his research. Nonetheless, the misogyny and hierarchy present in the authoritarian society of Urus is absent among the anarchists, who base their social structure on cooperation and individual liberty. So that's a quote from the Wikipedia that I borrowed, and here's a quote from Ursula Guin herself. She says, "Writers such as Peter Kropotkin and Paul Goodman, with them I felt a great immediate affinity. They made sense to me in the way that Lao Tzu did." So there she's making another connection between an anarchist and a Taoist in her own words. Fantastic. If you don't know who Peter Kropotkin is, he is a famous anarchist theorist who came up with many great ideas. In fact, if you want to read some ideas that can be applied in the modern day, the individual Derek Brose wrote a book on how to opt out of the technocratic state. So How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State by Derek Brose, and he shares some ideas by Peter Kropotkin. Even Jason Gregory shares some ideas from him. He's been talked about a little bit in the Taoist communities because of his recognition of some of its teachings. So I mentioned before about the abolitionist of the 19th century. Well, you can see I have some screenshots of the non-resistant newspaper, which, by the way, sounds a lot like the path of least resistance that is referred to for Wu Wei in Daoism. But you can also see the Wikipedia page for the New England Non-Resistance Society, which consisted of many abolitionists. It said that their basic outlook is that of philosophical anarchism, so much like what Taoism is considered. Now, many prominent 19th century abolitionists, again, those who opposed chattel slavery, were actually Christian or deist anarchists, and they shared many similar views to Taoism even if they did not know so themselves. And this includes William Lloyd Garrison, Lysander Spooner, Aidan Ballou, Henry Clark Wright, Ezra Heywood, Josiah Warren, Charles Lane, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Jeremiah Hacker, William Batchelder Greene, and Stephen Pearl Andrews. Later then came Leo Tolstoy and Benjamin Tucker and the whole anarchist movement as a whole. But some of these individuals have been credited for inspiring Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. So again, the connections are endless because a lot of these individuals upholding non-resistance can be considered pacifist views or using nonviolent methods to protest. So Gandhi also was raised on Tolstoy Farm, which is, again, named after Leo Tolstoy. You can go down this rabbit hole all day, and it's actually fascinating that people don't know these connections. Charles Lane was somebody who wrote a great length of detail about how we should have voluntary systems of government, and his colleagues were like, well, that's not really government. Josiah Warren, again, orchestra leader, inventor of the first rotary press, and he does a great deal of work, the most practical anarchist in history. Henry Clark Wright, controversial figure, awesome writings. Aidan Ballou set up his own freedom-based towns, and he was a preacher for Christian anarchism. I mean, these guys were very passionate about their ideas, and they wanted peace in the world, absolutely. They did not want chaos, that's for sure. And so there's a need for morality, as you can see through the course of these writings, and seeing that ultimately morality is not legality. Morality, if anything, is higher than legality, as we would recognize the Tao is higher than man-made government or our desires and attachments. It is being able to emerge out of that we become our optimum selves, in a sense. So C.S. Lewis helps us further understand this when he talks about the Tao, and he has a rather unique position on the Tao. Again, he is mostly considered a Christian writer. Quote, either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or natural law, or else we are mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must, by hypothesis, have no motive but their own natural impulses. Only the Tao provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny or an obedience which is not slavery. So he's saying right here that the Tao is the rules. So there may not be rulers present in nature, but there are rules, and that is the Tao. And this is essentially our ruler, right? And because many people will also equate the Tao to God, if not what God or Jesus taught. And so this may relate to the concept of synderesis, which is our inclination towards good. And it's also highlighting our ability to align to the Tao or conscience, which again is another word for common sense or common knowledge. Many people have the feelings of guilt. Many cultures share similar ideas of morality, and I don't think that's a coincidence. And C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Abolition of Man, even lists tons of different quotations from all the different cultures, and they all share similar messages of morality. So he's like, there's this universal Tao, and all of them were basically hitting on it. So he basically used the Tao to say, this is that universal thing that they were looking at. Right? It's nature. It's understanding our human action and how do we create order among each other. And so there is need for morality, but it's not the type of morality as in human standards that many people may think of. And so C.S. Lewis tells us more. The Tao, which others may call natural law or traditional morality or the first principles of practical reason or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There has never been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems or ideologies all consist of fragments from the Tao itself, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole and then swollen to madness in their isolation, yet still owing to the Tao and to it alone such validity as they possess. So saying that the Tao is basically beyond all human thought, all human-made systems. They owe their allegiance to the Tao. The Tao is what allowed that to be created in the very first place. And so when you lose the Tao, you lose all the systems. The systems are going to collapse. The systems are going to cause so many problems. The Tao is that moral law that he's telling us that really brings us together in the very first place, that allows us to have order. He's saying is the sole source of all value judgments. So you may understand this then as natural morality, looking at nature as morality. And so in talking about morality, C.S. Lewis explains again, the heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. And quote, the rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is a rebellion of the branches against the tree. If the rebels could succeed, they would find that they had destroyed themselves. So by man trying or attempting to go against this universal fabric of reality, they ultimately destroy themselves. And that's the whole premises of his book, The Abolition of Man. So let's talk then about morality in Taoism. Well, we know that there's a word in Taoism that particularly pertains to morality. So although we may be against man-made standards, it doesn't mean we're against morality. In fact, the whole idea of the book is that there's a certain way of living and there's a certain alignment that we have to our universe that we must learn from. The whole point of the Tao Te Ching, right? And so even Lao Tzu tells us that the man of virtue doesn't really need to think about it. He simply is among it. He's flowing with it. It's wu wei. So it doesn't mean he doesn't have virtue. It just means it's part of his nature. It's second nature. So let's look into this. Ti, which is also called virtue, is said to be unlocked by returning to nature or aligning to Tao, which is by fasting the heart. So we're really bringing all the concepts together now. And again, fasting of the heart refers to our mind. And that is also referred to as power. So virtue is translated as power. So our morality, what we know to do, not do, is our power. And it really is, because it's our power of choice. And when we fast the heart and we're able to think clearly and rationally, we can make a better choice. So when we live our own life with Ti, we find our purpose, meaning, or drive, our Li. And our Li, as we mentioned before, is our organic pattern. Okay, so it's that order that we can find in the universe. Although we can't put a name on it exactly, we can't exactly define it. And these are correlated concepts with one another. So Li, Ti, Tao, right? Fasting of the heart, anarchism. I mean, all these tie in together. And so by seeing this universal blueprint in action, we can then work with it. Because life is fundamentally right and natural under the Taoist perspective. Lao Tzu tells us, therefore all things arise from the Tao. By virtue, they are nourished, developed for, cared for, sheltered, comforted, grown, and protected. So it's like caring for nature, caring for the Tao, but being able to live with it, simply embrace it. To be carefree in a sense, not just to care, to simply embrace it, to live with it. He says the man of highest power, which again is also a virtue, does not reveal himself as a possessor of power. Therefore he keeps his power. The man of inferior power cannot rid of the appearance of power. Therefore he is in truth without power. And if you apply this concept of power to that of power in politics or the worldly leaders and rulers, which again is an authority figure that demands compliance, they really want to have their power and position of authority in their identity. That's what makes them the authority. That's what makes them the government, the state. And because they have this appearance, they are in truth without power, because they're not among the low. They're not with the water. They're not with the Tao. They're going against the fabric of creation. And so the people who do go with the fabric of creation, they are the ones who actually keep their power. The people who try to be something they're not, they lose it. They cannot hold on to it. It's an illusion. And so when you think of the word virtue, this is not some new concept. You can even go back to many ancient cultures, including the Greeks, and they talk about virtue. Virtue is a very common word to represent morality throughout history. The concept of virtues has been talked about in many ancient cultures. Greek philosopher Aristotle would emphasize how we need to create balance, so not to fall to an extreme in either excess or deficiency, similar to that of achieving balance in yin or yang, thereof Daoism. So you know how we talk about yin and yang and how we can't be in the excess or have deficiency when it comes to our simplicity in life, coming to realize our attachments and desires, and simply becoming content with our lives. Well, Aristotle provides to us the idea that there's virtue in the middle and there's vice on the other extreme ends. So we don't want to be cowardly or rash, we want to be brave. We don't want to be addictive or ascetic, we want to be temperate. We don't want to be stingy or extravagant, we want to be generous. We don't want to be self-deprecating or boastful, we want to be truthful. We don't want to be boorish or buffoonish, we want to be witty. We don't want to be quarrelsome or bootlicking, we want to be friendly. We don't want to be melancholy or boisterous, we want to be spirited. We don't want to be depraved or differential, so we want to be conscientious. We don't want to be envious, but we also don't want to be retributive, so we want to be indignant. We don't want to be mean, but we also don't want to be self-sacrificing, so we want to be benevolent. And we don't want to be lazy, and we don't want to be single-minded, so we want to be industrious, right? So these are just different balances that we may attain to understand that virtue is in aligning to the Tao or the yin and the yang thereof. Just another perspective to perhaps understand virtue through another lens. And so if we understand then Tao as morality, just as C.S. Lewis says, we should not fear being wrong, as we will be wrong. It teaches us of right. It has a part due to polarity. Change is law. It is Tao. But it teaches us then what is right. And we will always learn if we are open to it. Again, if we are always seeking to learn. Because although man-made standards are limited, nature remains to be harmonized with, as it is our basic foundational standard. You may see it as really the only standard, considering the fact we have to align to nature. It's the Wu Wei and the Zuran that we talked about before. And so our nature remains so long as we see this, to prevent the abolition of man, or what C.S. Lewis calls men without chests. We want to still have our chest. We still want to have our heart. If we're so up in the head, we don't have our heart. This is what C.S. Lewis is saying. We can try to be all scientific in the world that we want, but we have to not forget about our empathy and the Tao, which is beyond just our mind and our mental illusions. He's warning us about this. And so there's the objectivity then we have to worry about, because people will say, well, can we define what morality is? Can we get really, really specific on what is right and what is wrong? Now, again, there's a general framework that may be observed within the universe, but just how important is it to really define it? Because it can be perhaps counterintuitive, and we need to know when we cross the line, when we're creating man-made standards and we're straying away from the Tao or truth or nature itself. So morality has less to do with definition than it does its very existence and usage by understanding Taoism. You know, C.S. Lewis doesn't give us an exact definition of morality. He says, look at all these cultures and look at the similar themes they're sharing. They're looking at this Tao. He doesn't say exactly what the Tao is, because again, even Taoism tells us it's unnameable. And perhaps it's better off like that. Perhaps it's better off that we don't want and seek to try to find and have names and labels for all the answers in the world. Perhaps some mystery is necessary. Well, here's what Larkin Rose has to say about this, because I consider him a great philosopher among these ideas, and again, tying in Taoist anarchism. He says, whether the issue is math, morality, or anything else, there is a huge difference between trying to determine what is true and trying to dictate what is true. The former is useful, the latter is insane. In short, if there is such a thing as right and wrong at all, however you wish to define those terms, then the laws of government are always illegitimate and worthless. Every person is, by definition, morally obligated to do what he feels is right. If a law tells him to do otherwise, that law is inherently illegitimate and should be disobeyed. And if a law happens to coincide with what is right, the law is simply irrelevant. The reason, for example, to refrain from committing murder is because murder is inherently wrong. Whether or not some politicians enacted legislation declaring murder to be wrong, whether or not they outlawed it, has no effect whatsoever on the morality of the act. Legislation, no matter what it says, is never the reason that something is good or bad. As a result, even laws prohibiting evil acts such as assault, murder, and theft are illegitimate. While people should not commit such acts, it is because the acts themselves are intrinsically evil, not because man-made laws say they are wrong. And if there is no obligation to obey the laws of the politicians, then by definition, they have no authority. Because again, what you may see as the real authority, or the real laws or rules of the universe, is morality, is Tao itself. And so, we have a question of enforcement, right? Because Larkin Rose tells us there, hey, you know, these laws that are preventing these problems that people generally agree are problems, well, it's not the laws doing, it's morality's doing. Well, Alan Watts talks about this too. He says, just as we have to agree in order to communicate about language, we have to agree about, say, the rules of driving on the highway, the rules of doing business, the rules of doing banking, and so on, the rules of family arrangements and whatnot. And these are actually rules of the same kind as the rules of grammar. But alas, this is not very often recognized because the authority, the sanctions, the power behind these rules is different from the authority behind grammar. What I mean is this: if you transgress the rules of grammar, people will shrug their shoulders and say, well, he doesn't make sense. They won't summon the police. But if you transgress the rules of driving on the highway or the rules of finances, someone is likely to summon the police. And so one sees the authority of the state as standing behind those rules. But see, Alan Watts is helping us understand here, what's the difference? We're drawing lines in the sand. We're being so arbitrary here. Why can't we live with some of the problems that we may perceive as problems? Do you not think people will learn themselves to some extent? And also, is it the job of the police, or is it the job of everybody to do what is right at all times and to defend each other and to help each other? And is it solely just the job of the police, or can there be competing different interests to help individuals, just like any other product in the market, where they compete to become better so they don't become corrupt? Because nobody would support them if they were becoming corrupt. They would be dependent on the market. We'll be talking about that concept too. But even Alan Watts talks about conscience. He says, the moment you subscribe to the idea that your inner feeling should be commanded, you let yourself in completely for hypocrisy. If, you see, you tell another person that you love them because you know you're supposed to love them, and in fact, in your heart you don't love them, you're a liar. And therefore, the more you insist on that lie, the more you feel it's your duty to make your feelings over and to love that other person, the more you get yourself deeper and deeper and deeper into trouble. Because you're lying to yourself. You're not following what you know deep down inside. And again, most people, even the people who do wrong, they know what they're doing. They know it's wrong, but they do it anyways. They live their lives in contradiction, which we talked about early on in this presentation. And if we want to live with harmony with our universe, we have to respect and listen to our internal wisdom and listen to Tao and nature, because it all has a lesson to tell us. And we can't just ignore it. We can't try to push it down. Reality will come back and bite us in the butt. And that's what happens every time. And so honesty is key. We talked about before Radical Honesty, a best-selling book, and also how I wrote a book about honesty. Well, Alan Watts talks about it. He says, real honesty is a genuine basis of morals. Real honesty is always not pretending that your feelings are other than they are. Now, when we transplant or translate that into the moral sphere, the sphere of human conduct, the equivalent is this. There are no wrong feelings. There may be wrong actions in the sense of actions contrary to the rules of human communication, but the way you feel towards other people, loving, hating, etc., aren't any wrong feelings. And so to try and force one's feelings to be other than what they are is absurd and furthermore dishonest. In other words, if you feel that you hate someone intensely, it isn't necessarily the right way of dealing with that feeling to go out and cut his throat. But it is right that you should have the feeling of hating, or of being sad, or frightened, terrified, whatever it is. Like a sailor, whether he wants to sail with the wind or whether he wants to sail against the wind, he always uses the wind. He never denies the wind. So Alan Watts is teaching us a really great life lesson here about following our heart and knowing that the emotions that arise are okay. The extent to which we allow those emotions to affect us, that's up to us. Again, we can be choosing our responses so we aren't reactive. So we can meditate and we can have all the negative thoughts come to us and many different thoughts of all kinds, but we can acknowledge them. We don't have to fight them. We don't have to go against them. We can acknowledge them there, okay? And then let them pass as we focus on the breath and we focus on clearing our mind or being more disciplined in our own mind. You know, if we have to face our own thoughts, it's because nature is giving us a sign. It's telling us to do something about it, okay? But our own mind and our own whim and our own instincts can get in the way if we aren't conscious and we're not using our cold cognition for our hot cognition. We don't want to just act purely out of hot cognition. We want to use our cold and our hot, our yin and our yang. We want to think about what we're doing before we just do something, in a sense. And if we become so skillful to do something intelligently that we do so without even having to think about it, we become wu wei. So it's a beautiful thing to work with nature and align to nature without even having to really think about it. And that's the goal of society. That's where we want to get, to the point where we are so aligned to who we are and who we're meant to be that we don't have to think about it. Like, I'm myself here. I'm not trying to be someone else. And because I am always myself, it's easy to be myself. But someone who lives a persona and a certain identity so much of their life, a certain ego, they attach themselves to it. It's really hard to get out of it. But once they start realizing, okay, this is who I am, then they could practice with it again until it becomes wu wei again. Because I guarantee as a kid, they had some sense of honesty that was there until they were programmed into the adult society. Again, we learn from kids, we learn from other animals, but we learn from our nature ultimately. And so nature as morality, Tao as morality. Nature then is the only moral standard. Alan Watts tells us things are as they are. Looking out into the universe at night, we make no comparisons between right and wrong stars, nor between well and badly arranged constellations. We usually don't look. We overlook. The truth is revealed by removing things that stand in its light. The truth is already there. Right is already there. So it's like an art not unlike a sculpture in which the artist creates not by building but by hacking away. So you can think of somebody who's sculpting. They're hacking away at the clay, right? Or carving a block, right? Like we talk about the uncarved block. Carving the block is there in its original form and you're just hacking away at it to build a sculpture. Well, the truth is there, okay? The truth is in the universe and is being shrouded by all this man-made stuff, the materialism, the consumerism, our egos, our judgment, our minds, that if we can't get past that, we'll never see the truth or nature. So there's so much more we don't see simply because we're consumed in this. And I've always found that fascinating because I recognize there's a lot I can see if I reflect and take the time, but there's definitely more I don't see simply because of my upbringing, simply because of my lifestyle and being not so close to nature as, say, some tribes or the people in the past, our ancestors or Lao Tzu. I mean, come on, if we face it, they didn't have the technology and all the distractions that we have now. And so they might have been able to understand nature a bit more in some ways than we understand it now, even though we have technology and science and all the ability to do research and learn new knowledge. It's a sort of an irony that we're dealing with, again, with this universe. And so even Mencius tells us about the need for moral suasion, which the abolitionists of the 19th century called it. And that is basically the idea of educating others about morality. So Mencius, or Mensa, is often associated with Confucian thought, but his writings are often greatly interpreted as Taoist, as he disagreed with some Confucian positions. One such position is the idea that we need moral education to work with our nature and help it reach its fulfillment rather than working against it. Again, this worked for the abolitionists, so if there were to be another action that we may partake in our own lives, it would then be learning from people like Mencius who's saying, hey, we can educate others, right? And this is why I'm making this whole presentation. And you can think of it like watering a plant rather than carving wood into bowls or not tugging on your plants to help them grow. You are working with what is and allowing it to be nurtured into existence, just as Lao Tzu said before, with virtue we can nurture the Tao. So what is already there. So a baby comes into this world with certain organs and certain systems. You don't want to poison the baby. You don't want to make the growth process bad. You want to feed it what it needs. Maybe you want to do some breastfeeding. Maybe you want to give it some raw milk. You want to really help with its growth and development because now you're working with its nature. It's a beautiful, beautiful phenomenon when we are able to do that. And again, in the modern century, I'd hope we'd have more tools and resources to do that. And I'd hope we'd have food abundance like we talked about before with food forest. This should not be something hard for humanity to do. It's only become hard because of money and all the problems with the systems that we created, these overarching man-made systems. But again, we created them. So, in other words, we can all live in the societies that these people are talking about if we simply dismantle these mental blockades, the illusions that are holding us so deeply from our progression morally and naturally, as is the same. And so Jason Gregory shared a story about ultimately self-regulation. And Lao Tzu says, "Tell me, in what consist charity and duty to one's neighbor?" "They consist," answered Confucius, "in a capacity for rejoicing in all things and universal love without the element of self. These are the characteristics of charity and duty to one's neighbor." Lao Tzu says, "What stuff? Does not universal love contradict itself? Is not your elimination of self a positive manifestation of self? Sir, if you would cause the empire not to lose its source of nourishment, there is the universe. Its regularity is unceasing. There are the sun and the moon. Their brightness is unceasing. There are the stars, and their groupings never change. There are the birds and beasts. They flock together without varying. There are the trees and shrubs. They grow upwards without exception. Be like these. Follow Tao, and you will be perfect. Why then these vain struggles after charity and duty to one's neighbor, as though beating a drum in search of a fugitive? Alas, sir, you have brought much confusion into the mind of man." So I'm pretty sure this is like a fan-made story of Lao Tzu talking to Confucius. I'm not entirely sure, but Jason Gregory shared the story, and I find it quite helpful to understand that Lao Tzu is saying, let's not try so hard. You know, Confucius is saying, well, you owe your money or you owe things to your neighbor. Lao Tzu says, when you create these conditions, you're basically pushing yourself more than your natural means. You're going out of your means to do something. And it's okay to be active in a sense, but there's also a great need to realize the passive and realize that you have to respect who you are at your current moment, to not try to go out of your way. He says, like beating a drum in search of a fugitive. That's the analogy being used here, because you're trying to make something happen, and because you're trying, it goes against Wu Wei. It goes against allowing life to manifest itself, which he's saying, things will manifest itself if we allow it to. It doesn't mean people won't be helped. It doesn't mean we don't help others. It means we allow it to come natural. We're not doing it for fame. We're not doing it for status. We're not doing it because we say so that we need to do so. We do it genuinely out of our heart, out of our morals, if anything, right? But we get to choose voluntarily on our own behalf because we also own ourselves. So this sums up a lot of the concepts that we may have been talking about. And so ultimately we know our place. Lao Tzu says, those who would be above must speak as if they are below. Those who would lead must speak as if they are behind. Because the sage isn't contentious, no one struggles against him. And then Lao Tzu further says, I do nothing and people become good by themselves. I seek peace and people take care of their own problems. I do not meddle in their personal lives and the people become prosperous. I let go of all my desire to control them and the people return to their natural ways. Zhuangzi tells us there has been such a thing as letting mankind alone. There has never been such a thing as governing mankind. Letting alone springs from fear lest men's natural dispositions be perverted and their virtue left aside. But if their natural dispositions be not perverted, nor their virtue laid aside, what room is there left for government? I mean, he's just saying it exactly as I'm saying it. I'm not making an assumption here that Daoism has anarchist positions. I mean, he's saying, what room is there left for government if the people recognize morality? If they don't let themselves get perverted by their own belief systems and fears? You have to know our place, right? I mean, we're just free among the waves, like this girl on the side. I mean, she's living life. Do you think she's worried about politics and religion? No. This is what life is about. We're so worried, and it causes so much problems that don't need to be there. We start messing with other people's lives, and everybody's like, I just want to be left alone. I just want to live my life. But even the people who say that believe in statism. They give way to the system and don't even realize that they do. I mean, how absurd is that? It's crazy. We've been pulled into an illusion, and we have the blindfolds on. We don't even see it until we do that shadow work and return to that uncarved block. And so we still can have community. We still can have organization. Again, voluntary hierarchy, just not involuntary hierarchy. On community and society, Zhuangzi states it is, quote, an agreement of a certain number of families and individuals to abide by certain customs. Discordant elements unite to form a harmonious whole. Take away this unity and each has a separate individuality. A mountain is high because of its individual particles. A river is large because of its individual drops. And he is a just man who regards all parts from the point of view of the whole. So when people like to draw lines in the sand, they're already violating this unification of humankind. Again, our country is the world, our countrymen is all mankind. So Zhuangzi even talks about self-governing in this conversation here. Tlen Ken asks, please may I ask how to rule the world? The nameless man said, get away from me, you peasant. What kind of a dreary question is that? I'm just about to set off with the curator. And if I get bored with that, then I'll ride on the light and Somme bird, cut beyond the 6 directions, wandering in the village of not even anything, and living in the broad and borderless field. What business do you have coming with this talk of governing the world and disturbing my mind? Tien Ken repeated his question. The nameless man said, let your mind wander in simplicity. Blend your spirit with the vastness. Follow along with things the way they are, and make no room for personal views. Then the world will be governed. So, saying that the world has this self-governing order to it if man learns to just let go and not have his attachment to the idea that there needs to be a government, that there needs to be a system that tells people how to live their own lives. And so Zhuangzi says, I have heard of letting the world be, of leaving it alone. I have never heard of governing the world. But then the continuation of that quote is, you let it be for fear of corrupting the inborn nature of the world. You leave it alone for fear of distracting the virtue of the world. If the nature of the world is not corrupted, if the virtue of the world is not distracted, why should there be any governing of the world? Again, just to repeat that quote, it's so important because, this is, I think, another different translation. Some of these translations I can get mixed up here, but beautiful either way. The message that these quotes are saying to us, I think they're profound. And so Jason Gregory tells us in his documentary called The Natural Human Being, which again, I absolutely love. I think it's one of my most favorite videos online. He says, we can only leave people alone to live their own lives if we are sincere in our own introspection and willing to discard the conditioning that clouds our unity with our brothers and sisters. Where we are sincerely humble and free from agendas, we nourish and secretly transform the world. Again, through not seeking to transform it. A sage has no agenda, and this brings spiritual oxygen into the world. We all have undergone various sorts of conditioning, and we all have the same physical and emotional states. So we can sympathize with the rest of the world, which suffers as a result of the same hypnosis as ours. And that hypnosis, again, can be seen as statism. On the other hand, we are all inherently the same. We also possess the same qualities that a sage lives by. Zoran can only come to fruition when we trust that everything the universe has produced is fundamentally right and could be no other way. The systems of government, politics, banking, religion, and commerce are unnatural, but they have gotten us to a certain point, and we have learned many lessons from them. It's just that they are no longer needed. If we cannot trust the world and the people in it, we stand no chance for survival, because a species at war with itself is doomed. People often say that they trust the universe, but then they consistently condemn life according to their conditioned perspectives. And again, we can get really specific and say it's statism here with our evaluation and seeing more from this quote again. So we are obeying truth. You can see on the left side of this slide the golden rule shared across every single culture and religion. Again, spiritual teachings ultimately. We can learn from all of them. Look at that, the golden rule in every single one of them. And here's a quote from Larkin Rose. You call yourself Christians or Jews or claim to follow some other religion. But the truth is, what you call your religion is empty window dressing. What you truly worship, the God you really bow to, what you really believe in, is the state. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder, unless you can do it by way of the government. Then it's just fine, isn't it? So he's saying this is the hypocrisy with people's own mentalities, their own morality. Alan Watts even says, when we attempt to exercise power or control over someone else, we cannot avoid giving that person the very same power or control over us. So we obey truth instead of these man-made systems. You can see, the government is a religion. Doesn't matter what government it is. The way they operate, as they all have throughout history, is through mental manipulation to keep those in power, because, people want power if they're given that power by the masses. It depends on their belief system. And so that belief system can get reinforced through all these means: worship, crusades, deities, texts and symbols and prayer, temples and monuments, leaderships for like the church, and sins and conversion and blasphemy and ordainment and jihads and inquisitions and tithes and offerings. It's all there. Various sects. It's insane. This religion is by far the one that nobody talks about. And it is, again, considered the most dangerous one, because it's the only one that really is backed by violence when it comes to the notion of authority. And so when we're getting past that belief system of authority in statism, we understand anarchism, but more specifically, we understand voluntarism. We talked about this before, but voluntary or consensual interaction, or the non-aggression principle, is a basic moral framework which follows Wu Wei, or the path of least resistance, and it is naturally embraced by most people, with the exception only being in politics. So voluntarism usually consists in people going about their own voluntary lives and recognizing that they should not participate in politics whatsoever because it's connected to involuntary interactions. It's an involuntary hierarchy. So people can do whatever they want as long as they do not harm or aggress upon others, essentially. It's the non-aggression principle. And so insecurity makes us unwilling to agree to disagree and want to impose on others with violence, thus violating voluntarism. But if your ideas require violence, are they good ideas? Trying to alter what nature has intended or force its will is like flowing against a stream. It's exhausting and gets us nowhere. Again, as we have seen throughout history, there is no moral high ground, and we aren't to change the world, but rather allow and gain the world. Ronald Reagan to the communist leader Mao Zedong have both used the Tao to fit their agendas. However, it should be apparent that there cannot be an agenda in Taoism in order to truly live and let live. Taoism follows voluntarism. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have a strict goal or guideline. It simply is following the path of least resistance, allowing nature to manifest its own, allowing people to live their own lives, not using it for political, religious, social means. No, Taoism is simply understanding the Tao, and the Tao is unnameable. And it has no box that it can fit in. So when I talk about anarchism and voluntarism, I warn you again about the symbols, about the colors, and the parts of it that is unnatural. But then I do recognize the parts of it that is natural, that follows Wu Wei, that follows what Taoism specifically teaches. And again, Ronald Reagan, Mao Zedong, they did not teach Taoism. If they did, they wouldn't be in power. As evident with all the quotes and everything I shared in this presentation. And so it's really simple. You can see some like symbols and stuff on the side of the slide. It's really a simple notion. And again, voluntarism, anarchism is the opposite of statism. Statism is the utopian ideal that just the right amount of violence used by just the right people in just the right way can perfect society, right? So many dependencies, and it's all based on faith and belief of, oh, well, if we just do this, it'll be better. You know, if we just follow the Constitution, if we just vote this person in office, the world can't be changed like that. People trying to change the world is the very problem. And so we need to universalize nonviolence and believe that a voluntary society is possible because we know it's possible. We do it on an everyday basis anyways. Why don't we follow it to its end and allow people to live their own lives to their fullest? Allow people to live naturally. And so what is the greatest rebellion? And, Jason Gregory also talks a lot about this. He says the greatest rebellion is just being your peaceful self as nature and freedom intends. It annoys those who feed on fear. Violence and conflict are counterintuitive if we are solving violence and conflict. In addition, problems aren't new. Few have taken the Taoist approach of non-interference. And people will say, but if we don't interfere, that's wrong. With using love, nonviolent resistance, and Wu Wei, more positive change would manifest than otherwise, despite the appearing irony. We can remain in society but not following their way. Love, piece by piece by piece, right? Allowing people to live in peace, well then we are peaceful, because then it allows them to. We can't solve violence and conflict with violence and conflict. The rebellion is just being ourselves, allowing ourselves to live our natural lives. And to be more specific, if I'm going to tell you outright what it would be, at least one town not paying taxes and showing why to the rest of the world, using this education, using it as an educative motive if they must, showing the world with technology, which those in the past did not have to their advantage. We can now reach the world with this knowledge. They couldn't do that back then, all those writers I talked about. They had a great message to share with the world. But how many people were able to see it? Now, we can reach millions of people. That's amazing. You want a rebellion? Well, it's an awakening. It's people realizing who they are meant to be, who they actually are. And so, let us talk then about the economic side of it too. Taoism doesn't stop at politics and recognizing there can't be a political structure. Well, the same thing with economy, actually. There can't be an economic structure, Cory? Well, there isn't one set plan. There isn't set standards. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei does not just apply in a moral or individual action context, as it is similar to Austrian economics in the concept of laissez-faire, which translates to leave people alone to do as they wish. It means government does not intervene with the economy. So they don't do subsidies, they don't do regulation. Government lets the market go where the market wants to go. So people are in control of what they actually want. Governments cannot produce, but only steal and transfer what has been produced by individuals. And this viewpoint has been deeply studied by many researchers. You can find that information on Mises.org, Mises.org, or LewRockwell.com. In a quote from Ayn Rand, she says, "Laissez-faire capitalism is the only social system based on the recognition of individual rights and therefore the only system that bans force from social relationships." And she made a great impact on the world's people with her book, Atlas Shrugged. So you might be familiar with that, but I would say that these ideas, these simple, basic economic ideas, do support Taoism. The idea that if people want something, fund it. If you don't want something, don't fund it. But don't force anybody to fund something that you want, okay? People can choose what to do with their own property. And so this is the concept of a Wu Wei economy. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei in the economic worldview may best be seen in the concepts and works titled Spontaneous Order by individuals such as Friedrich Hayek and Chase Rachels. So when we say spontaneous order, what comes to mind? I think Taoism, that's the first thing that comes to mind. And you can see there's a book cover on the left side of the slide with, again, the anarchist symbol, spontaneous order. Saying that there can be order spontaneously? Well, that sounds a lot like what Taoism teaches. Again, Jason Gregory even has documentaries talking about it. And so here's a quote. "It is a system which has developed not through the central direction or patronage of one or a few individuals, but through the unintended consequences of the decisions of myriad individuals, each pursuing their own interest through voluntary exchange, cooperation, and trial and error." That's just life. And so the interactions of individual people in a market are quite simple. People give something in exchange for something else. From these simple interactions emerges the whole economy. Prices, combined with profit and loss, provide information and feedback in the economy, regulating the actions of different people along with the laws of economics. This means that on a large scale, things are not random and chaotic, but ordered. The economy is planned and organized even though nobody is planning or organizing. Billions of decisions are made by individuals that lead to the integration of all their opinions and knowledge into the economy, even as this information changes and grows over time. So it's able to adapt. It is like water. It is a Wu Wei economy. Amazing stuff. And so here's some really good information about spontaneity. Again, there's Jason Gregory's documentary, Effortless Action, Taoism documentary. Definitely recommend checking it out. But here's also a really helpful photo. It says, "We marvel at spontaneous order in the natural world around us. We enjoy its beauty and wonders and interact with it for pleasure. We savor the fruits of it and act in certainty of its results. We understand its necessity and passionately decry anything that interferes with it, corrupts it, or threatens its full and continued flourishing. As soon as the majority of human beings marvel at, cherish, and passionately protect human spontaneous order in the same way, perpetual war and poverty will be eradicated and humanity will flourish like never before." Again, telling us the solution is letting life be and allowing things to work in the order that they are designed to work in. That is, with the Tao. Things arise spontaneity. Things arise with spontaneity. Again, Carl Jung observes this, Jason Gregory, all the many Taoist teachers talk about this. This is not a new concept, and it is beautiful because all of nature does this all the time. And so we can make many connections, such as with that of integrative nutrition. Integrative nutrition is a connection we can make to Taoism because the holistic view on life embraced by Taoism teaches us how there cannot be a one-size-fits-all philosophy, which can be applied to health and diet. So we don't just have to look at economy or morality. So in integrative nutrition, the many different types of theories, diets, nutrients, medicines, fields, etc. can come together for the bio-individual or unique individual to see what works best, learning about themselves, for themselves, with guidance from the practitioner. The practitioner is guiding the patient. They're helping the patient. And so Lao Tzu tells us, within, this is where the world's treasure has always been. And so this is rather than the practitioner merely imposing what they think is best for their patient. By being supportive rather than authoritative, the outsider practitioner can help the insider patient, shedding light on the yin, what they don't see about themselves. And similarly, in naturopathic medicine, it was developed to emphasize working with nature and allowing the body to heal itself as they see it as intended. So again, spontaneous healing happening on its own without force, without invasive procedure. This is not a new concept. Natural medicine has been used for thousands of years. So why do we call it alternative medicine? That's because of conventional medicine getting in the way and claiming to be the only solution for people. Well, people are finding out it's not working for them, and this is why alternative medicine and growing food is back on the rise. There is no surprise, but it's also why a lot of it also gets censored. And so, let's talk about equality. Because we talk about all these ideas and recognizing the whole of society, but also recognizing the individual, there is an equality being shared here, however. Lao Tzu tells us the way is great, heaven is great, earth is great, people are great. And nature holds no prejudice and cares for all things the same. It views everything as so many straw dogs, neither loving nor hating them. And so Jeremy Locke from The End of All Evil further helps us understand this by saying, you live after the era of wars, and the only remaining step in the pattern of liberty is to answer the question held in the minds of people around the world. The lies of millennia have not stopped the unquenchable thirst for freedom that grows within the hearts of every person on earth. They are poised and ready to take the freedom that is rightfully theirs. They need only hear that freedom is possible, that freedom is real. You are the key to teach the people of Earth the value that they have within themselves. You need only speak and tell them that every good thing is theirs to have. You need only tell them that the glory of liberty is real and that it belongs to them, that their nature is who they are, that they shall be them, that they are meant to be them, that they are such a beautiful person, because we all are, and that we shouldn't put ourselves down, and that we could recognize ourselves beyond all the illusions and titles and judgments, so we can truly just let ourselves live with ourselves to begin with, and then we can nurture it. And so, being a Taoist, Sanjoy, in his video, tells us why most people won't become a Taoist, in the current day and age especially, despite the fact that they may be able to take drastic steps toward it that even Taoists may be unaware of, i.e. dismantling statism with voluntarism, as evident with Taoist anarchism. People may not realize how much of a difference it can make on society if you shatter the world's biggest illusion, the world's greatest religion that is harming the population. I mean, you can say back then, man, no one's going to free the slaves. Slavery is just part of life. We need it for the economy. And you can make all those justifications like that chart I shared before. But actually, You can end slavery. And all it takes is a certain amount of people, which history shows us not even like 3% of the population, to really make a big difference. Just the way they think, their minds, changing on a certain subject. And so how do we then bear with what Sanjoy says is why most people won't become a Taoist? Well, let us bear in mind these three main reasons, and we'll break them down a little bit here. He says people do not want to see their own failing. And that's true, because truth is uncomfortable and we have to plant a seed. So we can ask questions. Asking questions is low resistance, and it's shared as a very helpful tool by Larkin Rose and his Candles in the Dark seminar. Definitely recommend checking it out if you want to know how to talk to people. But as well as by the mere example of the Socratic method. Another method is to share your own experience and sympathize. So we can say, yeah, there's this problem, this is why people won't become Taoist, but there's clearly solutions like that. And so people do not want to change. This is another concern people might have, as Sanjoy brings up. And that's because knowledge that people do obtain, it's used for man-made values, rather than what is truly important in this life, if people do commit to any change. Well, we can help guide individuals in seeing their own priorities and contradictions. Another method is to show by example, so we don't have to point the finger and look around all the time and expect everybody else to change. Perhaps we start by changing ourselves and then show by example. Another concern he mentions is that people do not want to give up their desires. Sure, there's consumerism and conformity, and it binds humanity. But we can help guide individuals to see the beauty in life and having self-sufficiency, family, community, and the things that may matter most in life to truly fulfill them, with also understanding what can never truly fulfill them. Small new beginnings in exploring nature, invoking creativity and mystery can make a big difference. We started off this whole presentation talking about the importance in mystery. If people have a desire to start to search for knowledge, that's a start. And they may end up with the conclusion that, well, knowledge isn't everything, as we talked about later on, but we can also recognize that it can be a starting point. It can be a bridge. And you can build those small little bridges. You can prepare healthy foods for your family members that taste good, and they become healthier. And then they want more of those foods over time. Even though they might seem really resistant to healthy foods at first, you are allowing their body to condition to what you think is good for them. And maybe, and hopefully, it's based on your knowledge of nature and what you know would be good for them. And you can find that out more by talking with them and building a connection, right? So I think there are many strategies that people can use. So I don't want to get stuck on this idea that, oh, well, the world can't understand these Taoist ideas. They absolutely can, and I just shared a bunch of solutions that you can apply in your own life right now. And so you can even make the connection with Taoism and other philosophies that people say, well, they're not going to be followed, but there's a reason why they're growing. There's a reason why they're timeless. There's a reason why people see so much value in them, and why it's ultimately changing lives. Stoicism is one of those that has been talked about quite a lot in the modern day. It's an ancient Greek philosophy which held that the goal of life is living in agreement with nature. And that's what Zeno of Citadin says. And again, Stoicism holds many parallels to Taoism. Here's another quote: "Therefore, the end turns out to be living in agreement with nature, taken as living in accordance both with one's own nature and with the nature of the whole." That's from Diogenes. Here's another quote: "It's not things that upset us, but how we think about these things," by Epictetus. And then there's also the Stoic concept of okiosis, which means self-ownership. Because humans are like animals, but we are more than animals. And they have another word for that, prohairesis, because we have rational capacity. We don't need our instincts to dictate our actions. We can own ourselves. And that goes to the basic idea of self-ownership, which is emphasized, again, through the writings of Lao Tzu and Zhuang Zhou, with recognizing our individuality. And so with Stoicism or Taoism, the goal is for society to not affect us, remaining unharmed in the midst of danger, being able to adapt and learn how to adapt, I would say, is the main connection here. But I will say there are differences. There's a reason why they are two separate philosophies. But like anything, you're going to see some parallels within it. For instance, Taoism emphasizes Wu Wei, and I don't necessarily see that within Stoicism as much. Now, there's also Transcendentalism. This one in particular, I find, has many parallels to Taoism. And Transcendentalism is a 19th century school of thought during abolitionism, so maybe that's part of the reason why. Many of the Transcendentalists were abolitionists. So Ralph Waldo Emerson says, a form of inner spirituality that can only be expressed through imaginative or poetic language. That's Transcendentalism. Well, look at the Tao Te Ching. It's literally poetry that is very imaginative and is considered a spirituality. It encourages not living in the constricting guidelines of society, and that God is in each person and in nature. Individual intuition is the highest source of knowledge, and each person should have an optimistic emphasis on individualism and self-reliance, while also being able to reject traditional authority. So all those concepts right there, definitely shared among Taoism based on my understanding of it and everything we shared in this presentation. And here are just many examples, and for those of you who maybe come from the East, you may have not heard of this because this is more of a Western philosophy, but it is greatly beneficial. I remember when I was learning this in school, because they do teach a little bit of Transcendentalism in school over here, my teacher would call me a Transcendentalist, and I thought that was quite funny, but that's because I shared a lot of their views. And so here's a quote from Henry David Thoreau. He says, "It matters not where or how far you travel, the further commonly the worse, but how much alive you are." And Lao Tzu says similar to this, the farther you go, the less you know. Here's another example. "I ask not for the great, the remote, the romantic, what is doing in Italy or Arabia, what is Greek art or Provençal minstrelsy. I embrace the common. I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar, the low." That's Ralph Waldo Emerson. Sounds a lot like what we talk about with the water in Taoism, doesn't it? Well, here's another example. "To go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. But if a man would be alone, let him look to the stars, the rays that come from these heavenly worlds." That's Henry David Thoreau, and that's similar to what Lao Tzu says here. Ordinary men hate solitude, but the master makes use of it, embracing his aloneness, realizing he is one with the whole universe. I mean, these are very parallel. And here you can recognize the love for nature. Popular transcendentalist texts include Walden by Henry David Thoreau or Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So if you haven't read these, definitely you can check these out as well on your adventure in Taoism. It might actually help you. Walden is a perfect mirror. Nations come and go without defiling it. It is a mirror which no stone can crack, whose quicksilver will never wear off, whose gliding nature continually repairs. No storms, no dust can dim its surface ever fresh. A mirror in which all impurity presented to it sinks, swept and dusted by the sun's hazy brush. This the light dust cloth, which retains no breath that is breathed on it, but sends its own to float as clouds high above its surface, and he reflected in its bosom still. Wow, amazing poetry by Henry David Thoreau. So there's that great love of nature, and you can see some parallels here in the text of Walden and in the Tao. Most men, even in this comparatively free country, through mere ignorance and mistake, are so occupied with the factitious cares and superfluously coarse labors of life that its finer fruits cannot be picked by them. And that's similar to what Zhuangzi says, "To labor without seizing all life, and then, without living to enjoy the fruit, worn out with labor, to depart, one knows not whither. Is not this a just cause for grief?" Here's another example from Zhuangzi. "A pheasant of the marshes may have to go 10 steps to get a peck, 100 to get a drink, yet pheasants do not want to be fed in a cage, for although they might have less worries, they would not like it." That can also be related to slavery and how they like their condition, but they would actually be better off if they were free. But aside from that, This is what Thoreau has to say. Shall I transplant the primrose by the river's brim to set it beside its sister on the mountain? This was the sod it grew in, this the hour it bloomed in. If sun, wind, and rain came here to cherish and expand it, shall not we come here to pluck it? Shall we require it to grow in a conservatory for our convenience? And so, in similarity to the Taoist anarchist position, Thoreau even says that government is best which governs not at all. And here are shared paradoxes shared in Taoism and Transcendentalism. So there's 7 paradoxes from Lao Tzu and 7 paradoxes from Thoreau. Lao Tzu says the greatest skill appears like clumsiness. Lao Tzu says the greatest skill appears like clumsiness. Thoreau says the highest condition of art is artlessness. Lao Tzu says truth sounds like its opposite. Thoreau says truth is always paradoxical. Lao Tzu says the sage puts himself last and finds himself in the foremost place. Thoreau says he will get to the goal first who stands stillest. Lao Tzu says by action without deeds may all live in peace. Thoreau says there is one let better than any help, and that is let alone. Lao Tzu says to yield is to be preserved whole. Thoreau says by sufferance you may escape suffering. Lao Tzu says it is not because he does not live for self that his self is to realize. Thoreau says he who resists not at all will never surrender. Lao Tzu says the sage regards his body as accidental, and his body is therefore preserved. Thoreau says, stand outside the wall and no harm can reach you. The danger is that you will be walled in with it. So amazing. Some of these are really on point. And so, as we conclude this presentation, I'm going to give you some helpful tips to really bring a lot of these ideas together. For instance, you can actually make your own yin-yang with your hands, and I'm doing it just like this. This is basically what I'm doing. I'm just grasping one thumb, and boom, I can see a yin-yang. It's like an S symbol. So individuals merely holding hands may represent a yin-yang. However, there is one that you can do with your own hands to remind yourself of the polarity in life. Take one hand and entirely grasp the thumb of your other hand, then wrap your fingers of that other hand on top of the grasping hand. You should see a clear S formation like that of the Taijutsu. Okay, so just like that. There we go. We got a yin-yang going here. Look at that. Amazing stuff. I love it. So you can always remind yourself. I sometimes look at this, I go in the ocean, I'm like, oh, this is cool. Because I even just see the waves, and I'm like pushing the waves with my hand, and I get to see the yin-yang just in the wave formations. It's really incredible. I start to see it in a lot of things now. But also, we talked a bit about meditation in this presentation, so I figured to share some helpful little tips, very simple practical tips that you may be able to use. At least these are my favorite that I personally also use. And so you want to consider experimenting with your meditation in fasting the heart. And again, there's many resources online. Even if you want to get more specific, again, The Secret of the Golden Flower, or look up Taoist meditations, Master Gu, we mentioned before. So here are some simple tips to help you fast the heart and practice a little bit of meditation. Find the best way to breathe for yourself. That can include deep breaths, diaphragmatic or belly breathing, which you can do that, by the way, by putting one hand on your heart, like on your lungs, and one hand on your belly. And when you breathe in, your belly should expand. And then when you breathe out, your belly should go down. Your lungs, your chest should never expand or go down, actually, because these are short breaths. Your long breaths are your diaphragmatic belly breathing or baby breathing. This is the healthiest form of breath. It brings us into the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you do this, feel which is being expanded here. You don't want your chest to be expanding. Okay, now my chest might be expanding a lot because I'm talking a lot, and so I'm taking a lot of quicker breaths. But if you want to relax yourself, belly breathing is very beneficial. And again, do your own research if you don't think that's the case. There's a lot of material about that. But also, you want to breathe at your own pace. Okay, you don't necessarily want to time yourself, but you can utilize these tools as like a basic framework and then experiment from there. You can have your tongue on the top of your mouth. A lot of people will say this as well. So right now I have my tongue on the top of my mouth when I breathe. Okay? And you can pause after each inhale and exhale. So I can breathe in. And if you notice, my exhale is like double as long as my inhale, but I took a break between the inhale and the exhale. And so you can focus on that little brief period of time as well. If you focus on the pauses, on the breaks, and your nose and your mouth, you can get more immersed into your meditation, okay? And so you inhale through the nose and exhale through the mouth. Now, that's not a requirement. I've seen many Taoist meditators and Tai Chi practitioners who actually don't do that, but you can see what works best for you. I like to breathe through my mouth, inhale through my nose and then exhale through my mouth, okay? That's me personally. Now, you can also listen to sounds or feel your surroundings or focus just purely on the breath, okay? Now, you also want to find the best way to relax for yourself. So that might mean feet flat on the floor. Like if you're in a chair like this, that's fine too. You don't have to be crisscrossed necessarily. You can go about your day doing anything meditatively. You don't have to be meditating to breathe very deeply and nice and relaxed, okay? And so that's kind of like the principle of Tai Chi, is it's a meditative type of Qigong. So you're doing things more slow and relaxed. You're basically in a meditation, but with Qigong added to it. And so you can also just have your legs crossed with your back straight and your arms resting. Your hands could be open or laying down. And you can also have your feet on each leg or simply as comfortable. You know, if you're really flexible, you can put your foot on each leg in the crisscross position. But if not, totally fine. There's no strict rules around this. Just find the best way to relax for yourself, to focus on your breath. And again, there's many resources online in case you want to learn more. And so if you take a lot of those tips into your life, these are just some of the things you might want to notice. You want to practice your breath. By the end, you should feel more open, aware, and at peace. Your breath should be slow or at ease, as with your mind. You want to scan your body from head to toe. Where is there any discomfort? You know, you can feel your body, get in tune with your body rather than getting so stuck in your mind. So feel your environment, listen to the sounds, listen to your breath, right? And focus on it in a sense. But be able to let go to the point where it becomes so easy. I noticed that toward the end of my meditation, I'm breathing so slow, just naturally, right? Because I've made it wu wei, and I don't even have to think about it anymore. And my mind feels so much more relaxed. So it helps someone like me, again, a lot with overthinking, for instance. And so feel that discomfort. If you feel any discomfort, notice it, allow it, give it your attention. Notice it as arising. Emotions have a message for you. Give it your attention. It is like holding ice. Eventually, it releases. You may also consider journaling or other ways of expressing your feelings. Again, I've always journaled. I think it's very beneficial, so something I would recommend too, personally. And again, this has to do with internal alchemy or emotional alchemy, which includes transmuting your emotions. And so that means embracing our emotions as energy, part of change, as every step is valuable. So tin can turn to gold in this sense. Without detaching from our thoughts, we cannot question them. So use your mind, but don't be used by it. Do not meditate for any motive, because that is future thinking. Stay present. The whole point of meditation is presence. Okay, so if you're thinking about so much and you're trying super hard, it's the exact opposite. It should be very relaxing. Okay, it shouldn't be something that you're forcing upon yourself. And so what is then the action overall in this presentation, aside from meditation? Well, I have a picture of the Shire, and the reason why is because the Shire, to me, is sort of like a model for action. And I have a lot of pictures in this presentation, some of which I may have addressed, others are more symbolic that I may have not addressed. use your imagination to think about the pictures if you want to go back. But the Shire is symbolic for many things. In Lord of the Rings, which again, J.R.R. Tolkien was an anarchist, he actually said the Shire had no government, and they lived as a very peaceful community, growing food, voluntarily trading. And so the Shire could be seen as like a framework for the world that Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi and many of the writers we talked about before were talking about, where people live in sort of an industrial, agricultural world where they're still in harmony with nature. And so this is the action. The action proposed in this seminar is Wu Wei, or non-action. With this, we understood the place of moral suasion or education for voluntarism or abolitionism rather than the yin obedience or yang domination extremes of statism. So any peaceful modality, be it natural law, the Socratic method, unschooling, food forests, honesty, meditation, qigong, tai chi, naturosophy, or Taoism, can help us follow the path of least resistance. And furthermore, we may simply go into nature. So that, to me, would be how I would summarize the action part of this presentation. And I do hope that you may have taken notes or applied, as you went by many of the parts in this presentation, applied it to your life, because I find it incredibly helpful for myself, for instance. So remember, the message is always among us. Nature is the answer, way, Tao, or law. This message is an individual and collective endeavor. Through technology and through governments, nature is beyond. A million words is not enough to describe life. Hence, nothing is to be said. Don't attach yourself to these words or any ideology. Quote, "The fish trap exists because of the fish. Once you've gotten the fish, you can forget the trap. The rabbit snare exists because of the rabbit. Once you've gotten the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Words exist because of meaning. Once you've gotten the meaning, you can forget the words. Where can I find a man who has forgotten words so I can have a word with him?" That's Zhuangzi. I love it. It's fantastic. And honestly, it's true. I go around, I'm like, I just don't want to talk to people with an agenda who, can just be themselves. Those are the people I want. I just want people who can be themselves, people who are honest and authentic, who are trying to find themselves too, because that's part of the process. And so Lao Tzu tells us, those who are stiff and rigid are the disciples of death. Those who are soft and yielding are the disciples of life. They're able to change, they're able to adapt, they're able to listen. And so simply enjoy life. Remember that when you say this, you disregard that, and so on. You are left with silence. You find yourself being open. Again, many people say they want to live their lives, and then they, next moment, support the government, they support politics, they support an ideology, they want to impose their will on others, and they don't realize what they're doing. So they're enjoying life, but they're going with this passive yin obedience, but they're not really channeling into their yin empty, simplistic mind to help themselves see that the actions that they're contributing to with their yang energy is toxic and actually chaotic. And so Alan Watts tells us, Lao Tzu said the Tao is like water. It always seeks the low level, which human beings abhor. So it's a very mysterious idea. What I would have to say to this is, will it continue to be mysterious? If you abolish the world's most dangerous, unnatural hierarchy, i.e. the government, as taught by Daoism, as taught by voluntarism, maybe not so much. I truly, deep down, believe that. Now, you can share your thoughts with me, but it is the path of least resistance as far as I'm concerned. So, if we are to summarize Daoism, we have Tao, which is the way. It's the source of existence. It's the root of all beings, seen and unseen. It is achieved through acting thoughtfully, not impulsively, and meditation and reflection in solitude. And from that, we achieve Wu Wei, or non-action. It's acting in harmony with nature and living in peace, simplicity, and tranquility. Here's another summary of the Tao. It says, to escape the social, political, and cultural traps of life, one must escape by 1. Rejecting formal knowledge and learning. 2. Relying on the senses and instincts. And 3. Discovering the nature and rhythm of the universe. And then 4. Ignoring political and social laws. And just to remember that Wu Wei involves understanding natural and social laws to the point where you can act in harmony with nature. Okay, so the natural laws are very much different from political laws in that sense, if you want to differentiate the two. And so here's another great summary of Tao. Tao teaches the way how to work with nature's forces and not fight against them, to achieve harmony in oneself and with nature. The Tao is the goal, path, and journey all in one. Wu Wei is the method of following the Tao. It's translated as non-doing. It means that everything humans do should follow the natural course of nature. We should not try to change it. Go with the flow, do nothing and everything gets done. Wu is the concept of emptiness and nothingness. By achieving emptiness, we can observe nature and understand ourselves, i.e. meditation. We have to empty our mind of any impulses, aspirations, wishes, or desires that are against Tao. T is the power of a thing, it's the virtue. The T of a person is their self. By understanding ourselves, we can be happy and reach Tao. T is expressed through humility and meekness, the 3 jewels, the 3 treasures. And then again, in light of government, the Taoist view is that the government shouldn't have power over people because it breaks the Wu Wei. Because everything has life, Tao believes it is wrong to fight each other in wars. Man is unhappy when he has to follow rules and laws, and that may be seen as the opposite of Confucianism, though again, Leo Tolstoy says we can embrace all the cultures as long as we don't violently impose them on each other. And so I thank you guys so much for learning all about many of the information that I have in this seminar. There's so much more information though out there, and I want to give credit 100% to these guys who not only inspired me but provided a lot of the information in this seminar. So you have George Thompson, Master Gu from taoistwellness.com, Jason Gregory, Einzelganger, Alan Watts, Prisma, True Meaning, and Ian Withy Berry in particular. Okay, so these are my main sources that I used for this presentation, aside from, of course, Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu, which are, of course, the main sources for Taoism in general. Most of these channels, just as myself, are interpreters, people who are taking that material and looking deep upon it, applying it to our own lives, and finding it to be super helpful for everybody that we come across, and anybody that really puts the time and attention into this knowledge, which again is knowledge of themselves, knowledge of nature, embracing it for what it is. And so thank you so much. Follow your path, yin to yang, like this hobbit here in the Shire, walking from the dark into the light, into the outside world of nature, away from his man-made house. Though he recognizes himself as part of nature, he can still live in the house, but he recognizes that world outside of it. And so if he needs to go on a journey, so he must. But he will return to the Shire. He will return to his simple life. He wants to remain among the low, among the being that can't be seen by evil, which evil cannot stand the most. It's this simple little hobbit that does the most harm to the greatest evil in the world. So do not be afraid. Do not live in fear. Allow yourself to embrace your natural condition. And I really encourage your journey among that process. Again, we are all working on that journey for ourselves. Thank you very much for watching. Share your thoughts with me, of course, and share this message, this presentation with any of your favorite content creators or anybody you think who would benefit from this work. There's a lot on Taoism on the internet, and I wanted to make, in my eyes, one of the greatest projects dedicated to the topic, which is bringing all the information together, at least a lot of it. Thank you very much for watching. This is Cory Edmund Endrulat. Nature is the answer.